Erosion of the Land and Erosion of the People. Illinois in the Great Depression. President Franklin D. Roosevelt instituted a number of reforms and programs in the 1930s to counteract the adverse economic impacts caused by the Great Depression. The creation of the Federal Resettlement Administration in 1935, an effort to relocate struggling urban and rural families, resulted in the formation of the Resettlement Administration Historical Section, whose primary mission was to photographically document what Roy Stryker, the Historical Section Director, characterized as the unpainted houses, unkempt yards, eroded fields, and the social and environmental chaos that stretched itself along the roads. The level of effort to conduct this first-time nationwide photographic survey was Herculean in scope, a snapshot of the United States that has not been repeated since the photographic project ended in 1943. Part 1 provides an introduction to this unique photographic collection, accomplished through personal interviews and discussions with the original photographers recorded in 1979, complemented by many examples of their photographs taken during the period from 1935 to 1943. Part 2 showcases Illinois during the Great Depression as seen through the camera lens of these talented Resettlement Administration photographers.
During the days of the Great Depression, under the administration of President Roosevelt, there were many programs that were started to help farmers throughout the country. And one of them, under Henry Wallace, who was Secretary of Agriculture, was the Resettlement Administration. And the Resettlement Administration was set up to show some of the difficulties that farmers were having throughout the country, problems of tenant farms, sharecroppers, the environmental problems such as the soil erosion and results of droughts in various parts of the country. The Resettlement Administration had programs to correct this. Well, in order to make a record of all of this activity, Rex Tugwell, who had been the Resettlement Administrator, invited an associate of his, Roy Stryker, to head up the historical section of the Resettlement Administration. And Roy, being a great believer in photographs and the power of pictures, Roy decided to make this record, this historical record, with photography. I was very fortunate. I had been a senior at Columbia, and I knew Tugwell, I knew Stryker. And as soon as I graduated and got my BA degree, I was invited to join Roy in Washington at the very start of the program. So I was the very first photographer that Roy Stryker hired in this historical section of the Resettlement Administration. Later on, a couple of years later, they changed the name of the Resettlement Administration to the Farm Security Administration. And it has been known ever since as the FSA Photographic Project. We had some very fine photographers who joined the group. Many of them had been working in Washington already in other agencies or in other capacities. One of them was Walker Evans, who taught me a great deal. A fine photographer, great technician, wonderful artist. The other one was Ben Shawn, who was basically a painter, but who believed in using photographs as a way of making notes for his paintings. And so they were like a photographic sketchbook. And these photographs in themselves were valuable statements and valuable images. A third was Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange, who had been working with migrant workers in California, became a part of the project. And she was a woman of great sensitivity, great feeling, emotion. She went out into the field and worked with people. She had a great understanding of people at all levels, and she produced some very memorable photographs. Probably the one that is most famous is the one of the woman in the migrant camp with her two children huddled around her. And then, of course, there was Russ Lee, who came to work in the Farm Security Administration in 1937. Russ also traveled a great deal in the field and covered many of the areas that I was in at different times so that our photographs sort of supplement each other. People came and went in this photographic project, FSA project. I was replaced with Jack Delano, and Jack took my place. When Carl Maidans, who had been one of the early photographers in the project, left to take a job with Life magazine, that's when Russell Lee came in. So that there were altogether probably 10 photographers that contributed to this large photographic file. It's in Washington, D.C., in the Library of Congress, some 270,000 photographs. Farm security photographs contributed greatly to the work of other photographers and to the work of other artists, in fact. A good example is the fact that John Steinbeck, in writing his book, The Grapes of Wrath, drew heavily upon the photographs that were in the farm security files. And when the film was made, the famous film, The Grapes of Wrath, with Henry Fonda in the role of the young Okie who was going to California, many of the scenes in that film were based on photographs that I had made, or that Dorothea Lange had made, or Russ Lee had made. In fact, I have one picture, one still from the movie, The Grapes of Wrath, that is almost identical to a photograph that I made.
My trip through this part of the country was not by car; it was on a freight train. I was then I was then doing a coverage for OWI on rail transportation in the United States, and I had all kinds of clearances and permissions with me from the Railroad Association and from various government agencies, passes and so on, to ride freight trains of this Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe from Chicago out to the West Coast. It was one of the best assignments I could ever have dreamed of. And I rode freights in the cabooses and sometimes in the engines forward. I got off with the railroad men. I stayed in their quarters. I lived with them for a month. And my stay in Amarillo consisted of several days here photographing the roundhouses and the freight yards and the railroad facilities, repair shops, and railroad workers working here in Amarillo. That was part of a wonderful assignment that I had. Those pictures are still, of course, in the Library of Congress, and they're available.
Art, do you have a photograph that especially stands out in your mind beyond the very famous ones that we know of the father and sons in the dust storm and the skull? Is there some photograph or some assignment especially that you recall that you think you care to share with us?
Well, of course, there were many, but probably one that I felt that I had established a relationship between the effectiveness of photography and some direct action was a situation in Butler County, Missouri, where I found in traveling through that area that a number of tenant farmers had been evicted from their farms, and their belongings and all their worldly possessions were piled up along the side of the road. And nobody in Washington or anywhere else was aware of this situation. And I felt it was a disgraceful condition and that something should be done about it. So I took some photographs, sent them back to Washington, and also telephoned Roy Stryker and told him about this situation. And there was immediate action, intervention on the part of the government in Washington to do something about the plight of these people. And I think that there was a case where photography or the action of a photographer affected a large number of people favorably.
I'd like to introduce now Russell Lee. Russell Lee was born in Ottawa, Illinois, and was trained as a chemical engineer at Lehigh University. Just 1 month before the stock market crash of 1929, Russell and his first wife Doris moved to San Francisco, where she studied painting. He began to take photographs in 1935 when he became dissatisfied with his ability to draw. During the summer of 1936, a friend informed him of the existence of the Resettlement Administration's historical section and the work of its photographers. The departure of Carl Meidens to join Life magazine created an open position in the RA historical section, which Roy Stryker filled by hiring Russ. After about a month in Washington, he embarked on his first field trip for the RA. He ended up spending 9 months on the road documenting a variety of people and places, including Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. He has estimated that in nearly 6 years he worked for the RA and FSA. He spent all but 6 months on the road photographing. Among his best-known works are his Pie Town series, his thorough coverage of San Augustine, Texas, and his coverage of black neighborhoods in Chicago. His work for the Resettlement Administration and for the Farm Security Administration shows that he was quite adept at photographing people in their homes and places of work, thanks in part to his mastery of flash techniques. After contributing thousands and thousands of images to the FSA file, he went on to photograph for the Office of War Information.
How did you get those fabulous shots of the families in their homes? Specifically, I think the shot that Mr. Rothstein took of the kids reading the newspaper on the floor, and Mr. Lee's couple shots of the Christmas dinner and things like that. How did you get yourself into that family life in such a way that they seem to accept you so easily?
Well, I can answer that. The case of the Christmas dinner, I was in western Iowa, and I'd been told about some of the needs for resettlement administration grants out there. The people were in dire, desperate straits. And I went to the resettlement supervisor there, and he gave me a list of some people to see. And I simply went out to see Mr. Earl Pauley, and I just spent some time there. And I said, I've been set up by the Resettlement Administration supervisor. And I sat down with him and got an idea of just the background of his several last years, about the returns from the farm and so forth. And the next day he said, well, it's Christmas, and why don't you come out? So I did. And I went out there and took that picture.
So I'd just like to introduce Marion Post-Wolcott now. Marion was hired as an FSA photographer during the fall of 1938, more than 3 years after the project began. After spending a period of time acquainting herself with the FSA historical section photographic files and getting to know Roy Stryker and his recommended readings very thoroughly, she set out on her first photographic trip to the bituminous coal mining areas of West Virginia. The photographs resulting from this trip quickly established her skills in communicating with and winning the rapport of those she photographed. Occasionally, being a woman, often alone in the field, presented difficulties, and maybe you can discuss that a little bit. The great majority of her work was reported in the South, where she documented a wide range of people's social, economic, and living conditions. She also photographed in New England and as far west as Montana. Marion remained with the FSA Historical Section until 1942, when she found it difficult to maintain a household, have children, and work on the road as a photographer all at the same time.
I think I'll start back even a little bit further, which explains part of the reasons for my interest in getting into the FSA program. I'm often asked, why did I leave the field? Why didn't I become a fashion photographer or something else? Well, when I was in Europe at that time, for a number of years before I joined the FSA Photo Project, I had been interested and active in movements to correct the obvious social and economic and political injustices. My first teaching job after I returned to this country was in a Massachusetts mill town, or before I went, actually, the mill town job. And it was in a private school for children of the mill owners and top supervisors. And I lived in the boarding house where most of the single workers lived, the mill workers. And there I saw and was confronted with the vast gap socially and economically between the classes, the haves and the have-nots, the employers and workers. And this was an eye-opening and experience which was really too conspicuous to be ignored, because I was working for the mill workers, the owners of the mills. So I soon became bored with my job as a newspaper photographer, because it didn't give me any opportunity to get into that kind of thing. And that's why I went to Steiner and said, what else is there? Well, I really wished to, in my job with FSA, to effect social and political changes through visual means, and to help show the rural conditions as they were, directly and honestly, not to change anything, to make honest photographs, showing conditions to shock and arouse and inform the American public. Also, to encourage efforts to effect social justice and to eradicate some of the inequalities. Besides this, we, of course, recorded anything which was significant to American culture.
Farming during the Great Depression in Illinois, as recorded through the camera lens of Farm Security Administration photographers. During World War I, from 1914 to 1918, as millions of European farmers went to war, American farmers were encouraged by the federal government to increase agricultural production. Prices for U.S. agricultural products rose dramatically, and farmers responded by purchasing mechanized farm equipment and expanding their land holdings, thus incurring high debts. After the war, recovering Europe began to feed itself, while U.S. farmers continued to overproduce, leading to plummeting prices for their agricultural products. The U.S. economy collapsed in 1929 with the stock market crash, which marked the beginning of the decade-long Great Depression. However, the collapse of U.S. farmland prices and agricultural products had already been occurring throughout the 1920s. Now, plunged into the Great Depression, farmers had no money to repay their loans, and daily foreclosures resulted in farm owners becoming tenant farmers or sharecroppers on their own land. It is estimated that foreclosures averaged over 96,000 farms each year during the period from 1921 to 1940, with a record 200,000 farm foreclosures in 1933 during the deepest period of the Great Depression. The 1937 Ohio River flood, as recorded through the camera lens of Russell Lee, Farm Security Administration and Office of War Information photographer. The Ohio River flood of 1937 occurred during late January and early February 1937. Floodwaters extended 30 miles inland, and damage stretched from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Cairo, Illinois. 1 million people were left homeless, with 385 dead, and property losses reached an estimated $500 million, approximately $8 billion in 2014. The disaster occurred during the deepest period of the Great Depression, and federal and state resources were strained to aid in the recovery efforts. The city of Shawneetown in Gallatin County, Illinois, was completely inundated, and floodwaters rose to over 65 feet deep. The city was evacuated, and the entire population was moved to a tent city on the outskirts. Property damages in southern Illinois amounted to more than $75 million, approximately $1 billion in 2014. Over 300 bridges were destroyed, and 1,200 homes submerged. Damage in Shawneetown was so cataclysmic that the city was relocated 3 miles inland to higher ground away from the Ohio River. Black Belt of Chicago, 1941. From the early 1900s until after World War II in 1945, the term Black Belt referred to the predominantly African American community on Chicago's South Side, which developed as a narrow corridor along State Street from 39th to 95th Streets. During the summer of 1941, Farm Security Administration photographers Russell Lee and Edwin Roskam were sent to Chicago to document the work and living conditions of African Americans.
Look around and see what's there. Smell the flowers, feel the air. If life appears to be unfair, remember you're lucky to be alive. Don't be sad, don't be blue, 'cause there's a world of things to do. Listen what I'm telling you. You're lucky to be alive. Choose the thoughts that fill your head. Put some good ones there instead. I don't need no sunny day to make me feel life's okay. I just remember what my dad would say. He'd said, "You're lucky to be alive." I just remember what